Let's now review the normal functions and the clinical neurology associated with various areas of the cerebral cortex. First, let's organize the cerebral cortex anatomically and then extend that into a functional organization. And our first picture is a lateral view of the right hemisphere. And certainly, as we'll see in a little while, it's going to be very important that you recognize which hemisphere you're looking at. And kind of the convention, particularly when you're looking at the lateral aspect of a hemisphere, is that the hemisphere you're looking at corresponds to the direction that the temporal lobe points. So in this case, we could see the blunt end of the temporal lobe pointing to the right, and that's certainly going to be a characteristic feature of the lateral aspect of the right hemisphere. Next point we want to make is that the lateral aspect of each hemisphere is partially subdivided into anatomic lobes, and these are abbreviated by the letters F, P, T, and O, and correspond to the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal, and occipital. They're named for the bones of the skull that cover them anatomically, but it's very important to recognize where these lobes are in terms of one another and in terms of a couple of deep fissures or sulci that partially separate them. Note that you should identify the location of these sulci to give you an indication of where the lobal boundaries are. For example, the lateral aspect of a hemisphere has a very deep, sort of horizontally oriented lateral fissure. Fissure is actually a deep sulcus, although lots of times they're used synonymously. And that lateral sulcus, as we can see here, separates the temporal lobe below from the parietal and frontal lobes above it or superior to it. The second deep indentation that's important to identify is the central sulcus. This is oriented pretty much or similar to the coronal plane, almost intersects the lateral sulcus at a perpendicular, but it's a very precise anatomic border between the posterior edge of the frontal lobe and the anterior edge of the parietal lobe. Note that on the lateral aspect of the hemisphere, you cannot distinguish anatomically the boundaries between the occipital lobe most posteriorly from the parietal and temporal lobes that are anterior to it. Next, not only is the central sulcus significant, but so are the longitudinal or elongate strips of cortex on either side of the central sulcus. So let's be precise about their function and localization. Note that on the back of the frontal lobe, just in front of the central sulcus, is the precentral gyrus. On the other side of the central sulcus, on the front of the parietal lobe, is the postcentral gyrus. These represent areas of what are known as primary motor and primary somatosensory cortex, respectively. Primary motor cortex is localized in the precentral gyrus. Primary somatosensory cortex is represented in the postcentral gyrus. And the other point, which we'll see in a moment, is that there is a precise localization of function distributed across each of these functionally specific cortical areas in the form of a homunculus, which literally means a little person. So it's very important to remember what part of the motor and the somatosensory homunculus is represented on the lateral aspect of a corresponding hemisphere. And the answer is, it is the upper part, contralaterally, of the motor and sensory homunculus that's represented in these cortical areas, meaning that in the pre- and the postcentral gyrus, the area of the head is situated closest to the lateral sulcus. Then as you move toward the superior aspect of each hemisphere, you go from the neck to the upper limb to the trunk, all contralateral in terms of representation. So the upper half of the motor and the sensory homunculus, head, neck, upper limb, and trunk, half of it, is represented in a similar fashion on the lateral aspect of each hemisphere in the pre- and the postcentral gyrus, respectively. Now, since that's only half of the homunculus, what this means is when we look at the medial view of the right hemisphere, there must be medial extensions of these same gyri, and there are. So you can see on the medial aspect of this hemisphere, even though it's not labeled, the little line that's situated right there underneath my arrow is an extension of the central sulcus. And on the medial aspect of the right hemisphere, it again partially separates a medial extension of the precentral gyrus from a corresponding medial extension of the postcentral gyrus. So it is in these cortical areas where the lower part of the motor and the sensory homunculus are represented. Basically, the pelvic musculature, pelvic sensation, and or lower limb sensation and motor function are represented basically in medial extensions of the pre- and the postcentral gyrus. In addition, on the medial aspect of a hemisphere is the place where we have a distinct boundary in the form of the parietal occipital sulcus that separates the parietal lobe in front from the occipital lobe in back. And secondly, we know that on the medial aspect of each hemisphere is the major locus on the medial aspect of the occipital lobe of primary visual cortex. Note that primary visual cortex is subdivided by a horizontal calcarine sulcus into a superiorly located cuneus gyrus that's situated above an inferiorly situated lingual gyrus. And we know in terms of cortical representation that the cuneus gyrus is an area where we process contralateral inferior visual quadrant information, hemifield information, whereas the lingual gyrus, as we saw in visual pathways, is a site of termination of the Meyer's loop fibers. And since this is the right hemisphere, those Meyer's loop fibers that are terminating there and the right lingual gyrus is processing upper or left superior quadrant hemifield information. Next, exam questions frequently will show an MRI of a mid-sagittal section, which is in essence very similar to this. So in addition to functional localization cortically, be prepared to respond to questions that might deal with various diencephalic structures, requiring you to identify the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and remember the significance of the mammillary bodies in a patient with Korsakoff psychosis, as we'll see. And it also gives exam questions an opportunity to ask about cranial nerve functional and clinical localization and what part of the brainstem might be affected, either midbrain, pons, or medulla, is illustrated in this picture. All right. Next picture gives us an accurate representation of the correct form of the motor and the sensory homunculus and identifies the fact that these homunculi have a dual blood supply. So in our first picture 2 slides ago, we were looking at the lateral aspect of a corresponding hemisphere, and we identified the lateral extent of the precentral gyrus. And again, we said that the upper part of the motor homunculus, head, neck, upper limb, and the upper part of the trunk, was represented on the lateral aspect of the hemisphere. And then you can see quite nicely, extending down onto the medial aspect of the hemisphere, is an area of pelvic musculature and lower limb musculature, again, contralaterally. And the point we want to make here is that the extent of the blood supply of the entire precentral gyrus, it is served by 2 different blood vessels, 2 different separate branches of the circle of Willis. One is the middle cerebral artery. Its vascular territory is mainly to the lateral aspect of a corresponding hemisphere, and because of that, it is serving as the blood supply to the upper portion of the motor homunculus. And note that the anterior cerebral artery is supplying the medial aspect of a corresponding hemisphere, including the lower part of the motor homunculus that's represented as we saw on the medial aspect. And note that because of the dual blood supply, the cortical area that's right at the ends of the 2 vascular territories is going to be an area that might be subject to sudden drop in arterial blood pressure and what will result as a watershed infarct. And note what part of the motor homunculus will be affected, probably bilaterally because of the bilateral drop in arterial blood pressure. The patient will have a weakness of trunk musculature that's right at the ends of the vascular territories served by that part of the homunculus. And look at the similarity on the next slide of the sensory homunculus. Again, it's slightly different in its form, but its location and its blood supply is similar in that the lateral aspect of a corresponding hemisphere has cortical sensory representation for the face, the scalp, the upper limb, and the upper part of the trunk. Again, that upper part of the sensory homunculus is in primary somatosensory cortex laterally, and the corresponding sensory innervation of pelvic structures as well as sensation of the lower limb contralaterally extends onto the medial aspect of the hemisphere, and an extension of the postcentral gyrus in the vascular territory of the anterior cerebral. Next slide illustrates how virtually all areas of cortex are organized in terms of the cell layers. So note that unlike the cerebellar cortex that had 3 cell layers, virtually all of cerebral cortex is divided into 6 layers. But the point we want to make is that even though it's all 6-layered cortex, depending on whether you are in motor cortex or sensory cortex, the distribution and thickness of the layers is going to be slightly different. For example, all cortical areas have an outer molecular layer, and areas of cortex will have 2 granule cell layers and 2 pyramidal cell layers, but here's the difference. In areas of sensory cortex, such as visual cortex and somatosensory cortex, the granule cell layers are going to be much better developed and thicker. For example, layer 4 is particularly important because layer 4 will be the site where the thalamic projections in a corresponding sensory system will synapse. So layer 4 is going to be particularly prominent in areas of sensory cortex. In contrast, in areas of motor cortex is going to have a well-developed layer 3 and a particularly well-developed layer 5, the internal pyramidal cell layer, because specifically it is layer 5 that contains the cell bodies of upper motor neurons whose axons will leave layer 5 and form the axons of the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts. So you kind of see that illustrated pictorially over on the right, where there are going to be a significant number of cell bodies, particularly large ones. Some of the largest neurons in the cerebral cortex are known as BET cells. They are cells that are found in the internal pyramidal cell layer, whose axons will form those of upper motor neurons. Whereas on the right side of the figure, you can see the incoming cortical afferent projections, mainly from the thalamus, and you can see there's a major site of termination of those thalamic projections in the internal granule cell layer in layer 4.